Hey everyone, welcome back to Carrots and Olives. My name is Brittany, and today we're going to do a wrap up of February and March fountain pens. I did not do a March fountain pen currently inked because I was traveling and moving across the country. So, pretty much my February merged into March, and I actually had quite a few fountain pens inked up. So, these were the main ones that you saw when I initially inked it up, but I also had a few others here that joined the gang throughout those 2 months. And honestly, I actually also had a couple more. I wanted to finish out the ink in my Platinum Century 3776. And then I also wanted to finish out the ink in my Memento. And then I did get this fountain pen and I did do a video on it and I had it inked up as well. There's actually still ink in here from, I think this was early March, if not late February, and it's still going strong. I don't want this video to be too long, so I'm just gonna get right into it and talk a little bit about what I've discovered in the past 2 months. So I have my notebook here and I'm going to briefly kind of refresh you on some of like my main setup in February and the pens I use, which are here, and the inks I use. So I use this really pretty blue, cool color palette, and I do love this palette. I will tell you there are inks that are definitely a no-go with the combination of fountain pens I had. So when all of these were first inked up, for the most part, they did well. What I've discovered while traveling, and probably the weather had possibly had something to do with it as well, but a lot of my fountain pens did not last me the whole month, or even into March. And I was quite shocked. I would pick up a pen after a couple, like maybe a week of non-use since I had so many fountain pens, and it would be dried out. And I have experienced that before when I'm using just a couple of pens over a long period of time, but not within like 30 days. So I was shocked about that. For instance, my Jinhao dried up very quickly and was already acting funny within the first week. That, I guess, wasn't really much of a surprise. This is a fine nib, and this ink, the Vinta Blue Blood Dugong Bug How, was a sheening ink, and it was terrible for this fountain pen. It just did not do well. And so I couldn't write with it while I was traveling. So there's not much writing samples of this fountain pen. As for my Laban Cambridge, it did amazingly well. It stayed lubricated, even though this fountain pen does not have it. I don't think it has a seal inside, but somehow, some way, it was lubricated all the way until I reached my destination in mid-March. And then my TWSBI Diamond 580 did absolutely wonderful as well. These two were definitely a dream to journal and write with. And so I relied heavily on these two for a lot of my journaling. This one is still inked up. There's just a little bit of ink I'm trying to finish off, and then I'm going to call it quits, clean it out. These two are already cleaned out, and same with these three. The only thing that's missing from this lineup is my Traveler's Company brass fountain pen, which I obviously took with me and I was using, and it actually did really well, surprisingly. It stayed lubricated and I was able to use it, I think, without it being used for almost 2 weeks straight, I was able to just pick it up and start writing in my traveler's notebook with it. So that one worked out pretty well. Right now, I cannot find it, and I'm a little nervous. I think it might be somewhere at the bottom of our vehicle somewhere. I have to do some deep diving and look in other places, but right now it's not in my office, which has me a little bit nervous. My Platinum 3776 Century is a broad and it is a juicy writer. However, I had a Sheening ink, which was the Ink Institute Shadow Snow, and it just would clog up and hard start the fountain pen. And this was the first that I've seen a hard start ink, or that I've seen this fountain pen hard start on it with an ink. So, and I've had this pen for a couple years. So I'm realizing that Sheening inks, I know that they have more particles in them, but I haven't realized how much it affects even some of my good pens. Or, my pens that normally do really well with a lot of different inks. So that's something I've learned. My newest Sailor here, which is the Aura Borealis, and it dried up really quickly. It is a fine fountain pen. Yes, it's a fine fountain pen, so it writes more like an extra fine. And I was surprised at how quickly it dried up. I think it only lasted maybe 2 weeks, and then the ink just disappeared. And I had Sailor, Shikiori, Yamadori in here. For my Diplomat, my Arrow, this one also actually was a little bit fidgety from the very beginning. There's sometimes when I can really get it going and started, and as long as the pen is touching the paper, it will write. But I mean, sometimes it would be hard to get it to start. And then sometimes it would just stop writing as I'm journaling. So I don't really know what's going on with my Arrow. Then this one has been inked for a while, for a few months now. And it's funny because I do have a different nib, which is a Schmidt nib, and it's from the Benu fountain pens. I switched it out from the Mooman, and this nib writes really well. It's an extra fine, and it does really well with this eyedropper pen. But what I've discovered is that if I literally stop writing, it will act like it's completely dried out. At least the nib will. However, when I cap it and leave it in there for a day or two or even more, and then uncap it and start to write with it, it just starts writing again. It's kind of funny how this one works. So I want to, finish up this ink, but there's so much ink in here, and it's a fine nib. It's making it difficult for me to actually finish this ink because of these random hard starts. It's been a struggle with this one, and I'm almost ready to call it quits and to just clean it out. So that's how these went. As for the extras, which includes my Hawaii fountain pen, this one did surprisingly well, and it did end up drying out a little bit. So right now, I can't use it. I haven't even cleaned it yet, and the ink is already dried out. But it lasted longer than even my Sailor fountain pen. A big surprise is that my Escher books both still have ink in them, and they wrote really well, no issues. I mean, there is a cap in here to keep the nib lubricated and wet. So definitely this cap mechanism works really well, and it doesn't seem like there's any way for air to get in and dry it out. So these actually held up. They weren't inked as long as some of the other fountain pens from the very beginning. However, they are still inked right now and right straight, like with no issues. So Esterbrook has definitely surprised me. This was another new addition to my collection, and this was a more recent addition. I inked it up with this really juicy ink, and it dried up on me. I was shocked because the Platinum 3776 they have a insert to help keep the nib nice and wet. I just don't know if maybe this detail on the end has, I don't know, if it's possibly causing air to get through or in some way, and then making the nib dry out. But it didn't last very long. I also had this one left over from January, my other Platinum, and it dried up as well. So I don't know. I'm still kind of confused about it. These are all cleaned, and I had to clean them as soon as we finally got to our final destination, so that, you know, the nibs don't start to act funny because it has dried up ink in there. And then my little plastic pen, my Pilot Kakuno, also did pretty good, but it did dry up a little bit sooner than I expected, and so yeah, that was a little bit of a surprise too. I think it's just because I may not have actually filled up the converter all the way to the max on everything. Usually I just, the first time is all I give it, so I don't keep going back and forth in the ink bottle when I'm filling these up. So that could also have an effect on it. I find that those pens that have larger ink capacity did last longer than those that didn't. And yeah, so let me quickly do a score on here. And I am actually going to introduce something new as I do the score. It's very simple. I know in the past few months, or the first 2 months of the year, I had a more detailed scoring system, but I am not going to get into that because I couldn't really, I didn't, half the pens were not inked for majority of the month. So it was frustrating. And so I'm just going to give it like a final score from my final thoughts. And I am going to be using this fountain pen, which is new to me fountain pen. And it is the Monarch from Shown Design. And I ordered this back in mid-February. Or early February, hoping that it would arrive by beginning of March before I left. But then I was nervous because they weren't shipping out by like the end of the month. So I reached out, and they actually said they would hold on to my pen and ship it out once when I got to my new location. And I was so grateful because I did not want this to get lost in the mail. So I did separate my fountain pens. So I did separate my fountain pens that I use between February and March. And the top are the ones that pretty much dried out for the most part, whereas the bottom ones lasted for a good amount of time. And then, some of them may have dried out. So my 3776 out of 10, I would give this one a 10 because this pen writes so well and gives off a lot of ink. But because it dried out on me so quickly, I'm going to have to give it a 6.5. It was also the ink combination that just did not cut it. And it just wasn't, it wasn't a fun experience having to adjust your nib or try to re-wet the nib while you're in the middle of journaling. My Sailor Pro Gear Slim is a 5.5 because that hardly lasts. My Jinhao would write, but again, it dried up, and this nib is actually pretty good. So I'm going to give it a 6. My Moonman Mahjong, I'm going to give it a 6.5 because the nib is pretty good as well, but it just kept frustratingly stop and go, and anytime I wanted to rest, it would just not work. So, but other than that, when it was working well, and that's the same with the Platinum Century. My Pilot Kakuno was a bit disappointed because the ink combination was great, but it dried up as well, and I was just, it was supposed to be my like backup go-to fountain pen and just didn't work out, so I'm going to give it a 6. My Platinum 3776 Shape of Heart was a bummer. At first, when I first inked it up, I think I did a video on it, and it was so juicy and yummy. The nib wrote really well for being a fine, or I think it is a, I know I got a couple questions. Honestly, let's see what it is together. It is a medium because Platinum is a Eastern nib, Eastern manufacturer. They have smaller nib sizes, and so their medium is more like a fine, but it wrote really well, really smooth, but still have a little bit of feedback. And so I'm going to give it a 7. And the nice thing about this pen in particular is that I can write on both sides. Initially, I was writing on the back end of the pen because it gives me a better, less juicier writing. And I forgot to do that for this one. So you can see how much thicker it is when I'm writing with it normal. And then last, my Diplomat Arrow, which also was very disappointing. I'm actually going to give it a 5. It's a 14 karat gold nib, and it has been giving me a lot of issues. I don't understand why. There's like nothing wrong with the nib. And then with that ink and some history with a different ink, it just did not work out well. So that was very disappointing. And going on to the better fountain pen and ink combinations, my TWSBI Diamond 580 was wonderful. And in all honesty, I'm going to give it a 10 because it wrote well. It still writes well. There's no hard starts. It's juicy. It's been a while since I've written with my Diamond 580, and I forgot how much of a great writer it was. So I really enjoyed that ink and pen combination. Same with my Laban Cambridge. I'm going to give it a 9.5 because that one did dry up a lot faster than obviously my TWSBI. So it didn't last the whole time like my TWSBI has. Travelers Company Brass Pen wrote really well. There was no issues. I just need to find that pen. So I'm going to give it a 9.5. My Esterbrook SC Evergreen wrote well. I'm giving it a 9.5. My Hawaii fountain pen did dry up a little bit, and so even though I haven't cleaned it out yet, I cannot write with it right now. So I'm going to give it an 8. However, it did last longer than a lot of these pens, and it is a nice smooth writer. Esterbrook SC Oversized Candy. That one is also really nice. I love the girth of it, and it's just really comfortable to hold. one thing I wasn't really savvy about is the ink. And I don't know if it's weird. Pink ink, I can only stand so much of it. And even though the ink combination worked well with that pen, it was just frustrating to see pink. Too much pink is just like, I don't know, I'm over it. I get over it too quickly. So that was a little bit of a bummer, which means for me, it's not going to work. That ink does not work for me well with this pen for long periods of time. So that's why I'm going to bump it down and give it a 9.5. My Platinum Izumo, which actually I had inked up for almost 3 months because it was still inked from January, did well, but it dried up, I think, about middle of March. And so, I mean, that pen is just gorgeous. I gotta, technically, I'm giving it 9.75. It's just Platinum is known for being able to use the pen for a long period of time, and it's not supposed to dry out on you. So that is the disappointing portion, but everything else about this pen is just fantastic. Leonardo Magico actually was working for a whole 3 months, which is something I forgot to mention. But yeah, it's still inked even now, and it's been about 3 months. So, and the writing experience is wonderful. So I'm giving that a 10. So taking a look at everything, these are the scores, very basic overall thoughts over the past month or 2 months. I do plan to do an April fountain pen ink video, and hopefully that'll be coming out, if not the next day, the day after. And we should be back on track to do more like 1 month test trials with the inks. Oh, while I still have you guys, we can take a look through my journal so you can see some of the ink samples from February on. This was my Esterbrook SD, and you can see I'm like, pink's nice, but only for a little bit of time. And then this was the other Esterbrook with the green. I am missing days. This is sheening ink. You can kind of see that. And I have some days to try to catch up on, if possible. This was the Magico Momento, which you can tell I started using it again on the 13th, and it was working just fine. And then this is an example of my the Monarch nib, and using this Pilot Iroshizuku orange ink. I can't remember the name off the top of my head. And then a different pen, which I did do a video on recently, of another Esterbrook, and that's how I've been using the pens for my journaling. And you can see all the different colors. But I did have trouble because I wanted to use some of the pens I haven't used throughout the month and couldn't because they were all dried out. So there were a couple days on there that could have been filled in, but I was having trouble trying to find a pen that would work for me since majority of them were just too dry. And that was while I was on the road. So if it took me more than 5 minutes to find a good pen to write with that I haven't written with, I most likely just gave up from writing. So anyway, I want to thank you guys for watching. I guess the video is a bit a bit longer than I expected or wanted. And so if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them down in the comments below, and I will catch you in the next one.